The adrenal gland is located on the top of each of our kidneys. So we can see over here that the adrenal gland is this structure over here, and it's on the superior surface of the kidney. The adrenal gland has two components. It has the cortex and the medulla. So the cortex makes up the outside of the adrenal gland, whereas the medulla is on the interior. And we can remember that the medulla is in the interior because the word medulla starts with an M, so it must be in the middle. So since both of them start with an M, they go together. So medulla in the middle, and then cortex on the exterior. Now, each of these locations, so the cortex and the medulla, they will be producing different types of hormones, and they're responsible for different types of functions, and they will be controlled by different structures of the brain. So starting off with our adrenal cortex, which makes up the exterior of our adrenal gland, which is superior to the kidney, that adrenal cortex is actually controlled by our anterior pituitary. So first we have to remember what the anterior pituitary is and how it's able to control the adrenal cortex. Well, in the brain we have this structure referred to as the hypothalamus. And right below the hypothalamus, we have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is directly linked to the hypothalamus, and it is also referred to as neurohypophysis, meaning it is made up of mainly neural tissue, and it's not able to produce its own hormones, so it relies on that hypothalamus to produce the hormones, and then the hormones will be stored in the posterior pituitary. Whereas in the anterior pituitary, it is not directly attached to that hypothalamus. Instead, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are linked to one another via the hypophyseal portal system. The anterior pituitary is also referred to as adenohypophysis, meaning that it is made up of granular tissue, so it is able to produce its own hormones. So the posterior pituitary, it cannot produce its own hormones, but the anterior pituitary is capable of producing its own hormones. And during times of stress, the anterior pituitary releases ACTH, which is referred to as adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this hormone will actually reach the adrenal gland, specifically that adrenal cortex, and that will stimulate some sort of a response from that adrenal cortex. Now, we also have to go back one more step to the anterior pituitary and remember that the anterior pituitary can actually release two different types of hormones. It's either going to release tropic hormones or it's going to release direct hormones. The direct hormones, when they're released, they're going to go directly interact with their target environment, but the tropic hormones, they will actually go reach another type of gland, and that gland will produce the hormone that directly interacts with the target area. So in this case, when we produce ACTH from the anterior pituitary, the ACTH travels to the cortex. So since it's traveling to another gland and then that gland is actually going to interact directly with our target area, ACTH is referred to as a tropic hormone. It's not a direct hormone. It has to go to the adrenal gland. So when ACTH reaches that adrenal cortex, the adrenal cortex will then release steroid hormones. And these steroid hormones are lipid soluble, meaning that they are actually able to enter through our cell membrane and cause changes at the DNA transcription level and affect the proteins that are going to be translated. And this is going to be very important later on because we'll understand that this type of response, the steroid hormones, are actually more slow acting in comparison to the hormones that are produced by our medulla in the adrenal gland. So the types of steroid hormones are referred to as corticosteroids, and these corticosteroids have three subcategories. We have the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, and the androgenic corticoids. Now, some examples of glucocorticoids are listed over here. So we have aldosterone, and then for mineralocorticoids, we have aldosterone, and for glucocorticoids, we have cortisol, and then so forth. Now, the most important thing we should remember right now is that these steroid hormones are lipid soluble and they are released during long-term periods of stress, and the adrenal cortex is controlled by our anterior pituitary. So starting off with glucocorticoids, for example, cortisol. Glucocorticoids, it's in the name, it's responsible for breaking down our glucose stores. So remember that our glucose stores can actually be found within our liver as glycogen, or within our muscles as glycogen, or within our adipose tissue as triglycerides. So when glucocorticoids are produced into our bloodstream and that glucose stores are broken down, that can actually be utilized to generate energy within our body to carry out cellular processes. So remember that glycogen breakdown is going to result in glucose, and then that glucose can undergo glycolysis, the TCA cycle, and electron transport chain to produce energy. Whereas the triglycerides, when they break down, they give us glycerol and fatty acids. The glycerol will undergo a series of steps and then be fed into glycolysis, whereas the fatty acids will undergo beta oxidation to produce acetyl-CoA, which will then undergo the TCA cycle. So essentially, the glucocorticoids help us to generate energy that can be utilized by our body. But interestingly, glucocorticoids also have another function, which is lowering our immune system. And you may wonder how this applies. Why do we want to lower our immune system? Well, essentially, we want to lower our immune system to suppress inflammation. We do not want to be inflamed all the time because that can be highly uncomfortable, and we don't want that. So glucocorticoids help to lower our immune system when we no longer require that inflammation. So a fun fact about glucocorticoids is that for special health conditions where we are not able to lower our immune systems naturally within our body, or we have some sort of a condition that promotes inflammation, doctors will actually prescribe cortisol to help suppress our immune system to live more comfortably, so we can suppress that inflammation and lower our immune system. Next up, we have our mineralocorticoids, for example, our aldosterone. So mineralocorticoids actually increase our blood volume and increase our blood pressure. Now, it's important to understand how this happens. So essentially, our adrenal cortex, it may release mineralocorticoids when we want to increase the uptake of water into our bloodstream. So in order to increase our uptake of water, there has to be a higher concentration of ions within our blood. So for example, let's say we have this barrier, and on this side we are pumping in sodium into our blood. Now that ion concentration is going to be higher inside the blood, and it's going to promote water to move where high concentration of ions are, to balance out the concentrations on both sides. So when our blood wants to gain more water, its mineralocorticoids will promote uptake of sodium into the blood, increasing that ion concentration. We also see K+ exiting our blood, whereas sodium will be moving in. And so when water moves into our blood vessels, that will actually increase our blood volume because we have more water, and therefore it also increases blood pressure because we have a lot more water moving through our blood vessels. And then lastly, for the adrenal cortex, we have our androgenic corticoids, which are essentially our male sex hormones, which are going to be produced in the testes. Small amounts can be found in females, but it's generally found in males because it essentially stimulates masculization. And that's essentially all we need to know about androgenic corticoids. And lastly, the adrenal medulla. So the three previous hormones we were talking about, the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, and the androgenic corticoids, they were all produced by our adrenal cortex, so the exterior. But now we're looking at the adrenal medulla, which is the middle part of our adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal medulla is actually taking part in our sympathetic nervous system, or our fight or flight response. So the medulla is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, going back quickly, what was controlling our adrenal cortex? Our adrenal cortex was controlled by our anterior pituitary, but now the medulla is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the hormones that the medulla produces are amino acid derived hormones. Now, these hormones, amino acid hormones, are water soluble, meaning that they will not pass that lipid bilayer. Instead, there's going to be a receptor on the lipid bilayer which will receive the signal from that amino acid derived hormone, and it will cause some sort of reaction inside that cytosol. Now, remember back to when I said that when we had those steroid hormones, of the adrenal cortex, those steroid hormones were lipid soluble and they could directly pass that lipid membrane and affect the transcription and translation within our nucleus, which is going to affect the proteins that are being produced. And I said that that was a very that response takes a longer time. But now we're looking at our amino acids, which will not pass through our lipid bilayer. Instead, there's going to be a receptor on that cell membrane, which is going to receive the signal, and it's going to cause a signal transduction pathway. Now remember, in a signal transduction pathway, we have the receiving of a signal and then some sort of a response in the cytosol, some sort of transduction pathway, and then some sort of a response. This method is actually a lot faster because we're taking ready-made proteins that are already in the cytosol and we're releasing them. So it's more faster than actually going into our nucleus and affecting the transcription and translation to produce different types of proteins. So the main takeaway we need to understand is that amino acid derived hormones are a lot more fast acting in comparison to our steroid hormones, which are slow acting. And that makes sense because our amino acid hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are involved in our fight or flight response. Now, the key difference between these two is norepinephrine is involved in neurotransmitters, whereas epinephrine can act throughout the body anywhere else. Now, when these two amino acid derived hormones are produced, they can bind to specific types of receptors, causing a different response. So if they bind to a beta receptor, it's going to cause vasodilation or bronchodilation, dilation being referred to as it gets bigger, whereas if it binds to an alpha receptor, it's going to cause vasoconstriction, so it's going to shrink or decrease. So essentially, what we need to understand between the difference between the medulla and the cortex is medulla is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. It produces hormones for a short-term response, and it is more fast-acting because we have water-soluble hormones, whereas the cortex is responsible for more longer-term effects, and it is more slow-acting, and it's controlled by the anterior pituitary.